morning, and welcome to Morning Movie News, where I am happy to say I have emerged from the snowstorm unscathed. It was a really severe snowstorm, actually. I wanted to go out in it on Saturday because it's fun to walk around like in a snowstorm, but it actually became a real snowstorm with really heavy winds, and you could look out your window and be like, man, that looks legit. So I didn't go out, and I hope everybody else stayed safe as well because, the selfie ain't worth it. So I did go out the next day, and it was really awesome, and it was like piles of snow as high as you, and everybody going out and frolicking and having a good time. And then, of course, Monday morning, it's just giant piles of slush and people not letting you pass and everyone being a jerk and difficult to navigate the city. But I made it into the office, and we have a very nice episode to discuss today with a lot of really gossipy things. But the first thing I want to do is give away those 2 copies of Everest. How fitting, right? The weekend after Snowzilla, we have a great movie about a harrowing film about climbing one of the coldest and snowiest points on Earth. And a lot of people really had wonderful entries. Again, what you had to do was you had to tweet me at Grace Randolph, and you had to include the hashtag Dolby Atmos and Everest, and then tell me why you would climb Everest. So I got a bunch of really great submissions, and it was hard to pick 2, but I have done it. All right, so the first Blu-ray, and if you hear your name, check your Twitter sometime today. It might not be right away, but sometime today I will send you a direct message on how to get your Blu-ray copy. But anyway, the first Blu-ray copy goes to Alan Grinchpoon, who says, at Grace Randolph, I know hashtag Dolby Atmos is all about sound, but I'd climb hashtag Everest for the silence. I was like, ooh, good use of the Dolby Atmos. Dolby Atmos, of course, does the really intense sound mix for the film and also for the Blu-ray release. They're very proud of the work that they did, but I thought that Alan did a nice job, ironically referencing that with his answer. So that was great. And then a couple of people did variations on this, but Augustin Antonio was the first to do it, and I thought it was very clever. So Augustin Antonio said, at Grace Randolph, hashtag Dolby Atmos, hashtag Everest, I would climb Mount Everest so I can plant a hashtag Beyond the Trailer flag on it and win an Everest Blu-ray. I thought that was hilarious. Augustin, I'm not just sending you a Blu-ray, I'm tempted to send you to Everest yourself, so you could do that. But when you watch the movie, you'll see why that is, a little bit out of my price range to send you to Everest, and why you might not want to go anyway. But both of you, Alan and Augustin, enjoy the movie. Thank you everybody for entering, and thank you again also for Dolby Atmos for giving me these Blu-rays to give to you. All right, so let's get on with today's episode. There is a lot to talk about, and a lot of it, it's a very contentious episode, so I'm excited to see the comment section today. So we're going to start out with the Academy, and on Friday, how they changed the rules for who votes for the Oscars. Now, in the morning, I was so busy trying to get reviews up and get out of the office to beat the snowstorm, I didn't even see the story until I got home. And when I got home, I was talking to my parents on the phone, and they were like, oh, did you see the Academy Awards news story? And I was like, yeah, that's Charlotte Rampling and Michael Caine, boy. Woo! They just talked themselves into a corner, and I hope that they can, Michael Caine particularly can recover, because he had a nice little resurgence of his career going there. And they're like, no, not that story, the new rules. And I was like, what? So I immediately went to look at it, and I've been following it all weekend as the story develops, because the people in Hollywood are darn mad about these changes, and so we're gonna factor that into the discussion as well, the reaction to these changes. But it blew my mind what they've done. So let me tell you what they've done, and then we'll discuss the context, the precedent, and then also the reaction. Vocabulary day here on Morning Movie News. So anyway, the changes have not been to how many movies can be nominated. A lot of people felt they would make it a hard and fast 10, which I'm actually, I don't know. My Best Picture Oscar video will be going up later this week, and so I think that there's a big argument to be made for and against 10 nominations. But anyway, this is for voters. They've decided to change the voting situation. So the new rule is that everybody who's a member of the Academy will get to enjoy the privileges of being a member, which includes free screenings. However, if you want to actually vote in the Academy Awards, here's what has to happen. Now, if you've ever been nominated or win an Oscar, you vote for life. But if that has not happened to you, because, it's a select group, and there are many more people working in the industry that can be nominated, you have to work in 10-year segments. So every decade, or every 10-year period after you've become a member, they are going to see if you've worked in that decade. And if you haven't worked, you lose your voting privileges. Now, if you work 3-decade slots in a row, if you qualify 3 times in a row, so that's a 30-year career, then you're good for life. So if you want to retire after that, you don't have to worry about losing your vote. Also, for new members, it's no longer going to be a nominating process where someone has to sponsor you, like a country club, where someone who's already a member has to vouch for you and recommend you for membership. That is not going to be the case anymore. It's going to become more like an admissions board for a school, where they'll have a committee that picks new Academy members themselves and offers membership. They're also adding 3 new members to that committee and 3 new members to the board of directors of the Academy overall. And those new members are supposed to reflect the diversity they would like to see in the voting body, which, by the way, means that diversity is not currently there. They also said that they want to double the number of non-white and female members in the Academy by 2020. And that's also shocking that they would have so few, especially, of both, considering who sees movies, right? I mean, both women and non-white audiences have become extremely powerful at the box office. To not have them represented in the voting block, and even the Academy itself, is kind of shocking. But they're trying to fix it. Now, the press, I'm trying to make sure I keep this in order. So those are the rules that have been changed. Now, I said there was a precedent, right? Well, it turns out that back in the 1970s, I believe 1975, Gregory Peck, who was then head of the Academy, did the same thing, because there was a similar complaint, not about lack of diversity in the nominations, but that the nominations seemed a little antiquated, a little out of touch. And so Gregory Peck said, okay, well, let's get more in-touch people voting for the Oscars. And he did the exact same thing. And so this isn't something that was made up just to fix this problem. It's like, it's just they're a cleaning house, so to speak. So I wish that the Academy, when they're getting so much flack for this, would fight back and say, well, Gregory Peck did it, and Gregory Peck is a heck of a guy. It's like one less than Jimmy Stewart doing it. Like, he is like the B team of respectability in Hollywood. Now, speaking of respectability, this has been the reaction to this. Now, obviously, a lot of older voters have lost their, shit, okay, over being told they can't vote. And they're just up in arms. It's like, you would not believe. I would actually encourage you to go and read some of these comments, because they're very sobering. And I think that while there have been a lot of articles with the voters saying, we're not racist, if you go and read their response to this, you're like, you kind of seem racist, okay? Like, for instance, one person said, to throw out the white older voters is horrible because white older people are the backbone of this industry. And it's like, what? How about what's the future of this industry, right? I mean, that was a shocking comment. I'd be like, what's your name? You're going to lose your voting privileges right now. So anyway, a lot of people, one of the first reactions was, well, there goes the prestige of the Oscars. And it's like, why? Because the Oscars really, I think, seem out of touch at this point. I think they do not reflect what the audience enjoys, and they don't reflect what's happening in the industry. And so this has to be done to, I feel, save their prestige and not make them seem like some old antiquated, fart award show that nobody should care about. I mean, when I was shocked that people could vote who weren't working. I thought that was a really shocking revelation, and that people were sponsored to be members of the Academy. That to me was just absolutely mind-boggling, and it made me actually feel a little bit less about the Oscars. Like, immediately, I was like, oh, I thought this was like some really big deal with like a jury of your peers, but this is just like a bunch of people who worked for a very short time, really didn't help to shape the industry, and they get to decide who gets rewarded. I mean, that seems like ridiculous. Talk about just like the worst kind of favoritism. So I thought that was just ridiculous, right? I mean, they still get to see the movies for free, so what's the problem? And by the way, a lot of them didn't watch the movies, and that's one of the reasons and other reasons that these votes are so off. Like, did they all watch Straight Outta Compton all the way through? Did they all watch Beasts of No Nation? I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. And so I'm just, I'm curious what your thoughts on this are. I think that, you have to have Idris Elba I think the best way to say this is Idris Elba made a really wonderful speech, and I tweeted this out also on Friday, I believe, or late Thursday night, to Parliament. And I'll put a link to that below in the video description. And Idris Elba talked about the need for diversity. And he really was specific here to say, I'm not just talking about black people. Please don't think that I'm coming to you as a black person trying to look out only for other black people. He said, I'm really hoping for a diversity of thought. And if we have a true diversity of thought, all these other problems will take care of themselves. And I think that couldn't be better said. And I think his speech is so stirring, so moving, and he does such a good job of explaining the problem to people who I think feel there isn't a problem, that you really should read it. I put it up there with Lana Wachowski's speech that she gave, talking about her experiences in the film industry as not only as a transgender woman, but also as a creative talent. I mean, really brilliant stuff. So one of the best speeches I've ever read. And so I really think that everybody should read it, and I think it should be forwarded to all Academy voters. But I'm curious to what you think of this. I think this is very exciting. Will it 100% fix the problem? I don't think so. Not necessarily. We'll see. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, and I think that we were definitely headed in the wrong direction before. So we'll see. I mean, the privilege, they always say white privilege, and I'm not a big fan of that statement because I think it undercuts, white people have problems too, but I think, by no means should other people's problems be belittled or anyone's problems be considered more important than others. And I think that this just reeks of white privilege, and it's the first time I've ever seen a good example of white privilege, and I'm really upset about it. All right, so that's the first story of the day. Now, talking about being upset about something, there was a big story that made the rounds also on Friday, and I was like, ooh, I'm going to cover that. I'm going to cover that on Monday because that's a good one. But then, lo and behold, when I went to double check all the different aspects of the story, I found that only The Guardian, had reported that it was total crap. And this is the story from The Hollywood Reporter that they're making a Labyrinth remake. And the fact that nobody corrected this story is shocking to me. And I'm curious to what you think of these clickbait stories. And that's, by the way, what Nicole Perlman called it herself. She was the one who was reported by The Hollywood Reporter as being the new writer on this Labyrinth remake. David Bowie tragically just passed away. That's one of his most iconic performances. And that was from the Jim Henson Company. And so it was reported that Nicole Perlman, who is a Disney writer, comes from the Disney writing program, by the way, so good program. But she, of course, worked on Guardians of the Galaxy, Inside Out, and she's now working on Captain Marvel. And so it said that she was going to rewrite this. And she immediately took to Twitter and said, that is a lie. Don't fall for that clickbait article. Nobody should remake Labyrinth, and I certainly will not be doing that. I'm paraphrasing, but she was very adamant about it. And then also, The Guardian said, we've reached out to Jim Henson, the Jim Henson Company, about whether or not there's going to be a remake of Labyrinth. They have not responded to us yet. But how did The Hollywood Reporter not check with the sources before publishing this story? I think there's just such a desire to be first. It's a little bit like what's happened to actual news with the cable news cycle, the 24-hour news cycle. There's such a desire. I mean, go watch Anchorman 2, which is one of the best commentaries on the news industry I've ever seen, and it's a comedy, which is why one of the reasons I like that movie so much. It actually made my top 10 list that year that it came out. It was just brilliant. I mean, you think Spotlight is good, which is, but I think that Anchorman 2, believe it or not, is actually just as important a commentary on journalism as well. But I think that entertainment journalism is also in danger of the same problem. But, you have like your fan sites that, you expect that. But The Hollywood Reporter, that's just shocking. And so The Hollywood Reporter either should have withdrawn the story, or they should have named their sources as to why they felt they could report this. But I'm curious, what do you think of it? Are you getting tired of clickbait stories? Do you feel like as a consumer of movie news, do you feel it's something that's hurting the experience for you, or you feel it's a necessary evil to get these stories so early? And most of the time they do turn out to be true. And you know what? Maybe The Hollywood Reporter will turn to end up being correct in some regard, but they're certainly not correct with Nicole Perlman, who shot this down big time. All right, so that's the second story of the day, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Now, for the third story, I really wanted to get a Sundance story in here, but there's not a lot of sexy news coming out of Sundance, right? I mean, none of the big movies are making a huge splash. There are some big deals. Amazon made a huge deal, $10 million for a Kenneth Lonergan film starring Casey Affleck and Kyle Chandler and I think Lucas Hall from, plays Havoc in the X-Men movies these days. So that, Netflix and Amazon are making all the big deals, but I don't think there's any huge story coming out of Sundance, like, this is the story. But I did find one story that I thought was worth discussing this morning. And this was, I think, my favorite story to come out of Sundance. And this actually had to do with transportation to the festival. Now, as you may or may not know, Sundance takes place in Park City, Utah, which is a considerable commute from Salt Lake City. So Uber, which is a co-sponsor of the festival this year, and Blade, a private helicopter company, decided to offer affordable helicopter rides to and from Salt Lake City to Park City for Sundance. And it would run, basically 12 hours, like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., approximately. And it was like $500 a ride, but it was for like 5 to 6 people in each helicopter. So, a company or people could pool their resources together and save a lot of time getting to the festival. Now, besides who would get into an Uber helicopter, right? I'd be like, this seems sketchy. The real problem with this is that Uber and Blade apparently did not get permits from the city to fly helicopters in and out of Park City, which is pretty shocking. And they felt obviously that they'd gotten around it by landing on private property. They got, you hear a lot of this from the tech sector these days. For Airbnb, for instance, I've seen Shark Tank. I've seen other business models where they get, private homes, for, people to rent them out for, going to see a football game, etc. So they said, okay, we'll get a private citizen. We'll pay them a bunch of money, and they'll allow our helicopters to land on their estate. And then they were saying, oh, we'll take you in a nice car right to the main stretch. You're going to be right there. But even though the person who owned the private property said it was okay, none of their neighbors did, right? None of the businesses around them, or if it was residential, they didn't clarify what kind of spaces these were, what kind of private properties they were, but nobody else had agreed. There's also an ordinance about sound, obviously, not disrupting anyone else's living experience or their business, right? I mean, think about it. Helicopters taking, landing and taking off 12 hours a day. That would be super annoying. Not to mention the safety issue of the airspace. And I'm particularly sensitive to this because in New York City, we used to have a lot of helicopters flying up and down, giving helicopter tours, people commuting to the Hamptons and to the airport, etc. And then we had a couple of really tragic accidents where helicopters would run into each other or they'd run into a small airplane and people died. It was really quite horrible. And if they didn't die, they were seriously injured. So actually, you can't fly as many helicopters around New York City anymore because of that. And so I think that not only do you have a sound issue, but there's a huge safety issue here to the people on the ground and the people in the air. So the fact that Uber and Blade would offer such a convenience without getting the proper paperwork is really shocking. So I would not only say this is a very interesting story about the tech sector, the corners that they often cut, but also Sundance, and I guess you could say another example of white privilege. But no, I'm sure everybody of all different kinds of demographics was on those helicopters, although they shouldn't have been. And so that's the other thing I want to say. This is a really great example of make sure you do your due diligence on whenever you're going to ride on some kind of slap together at the last minute style of transportation. Is it safe? I'm reminded of that horrible story about, I forget his name. I was a news reporter who was killed tragically in a car accident here in New York City because the car company that CBS employed to take their people around didn't do their check. And so he was in a car with a driver who had only one arm because the other arm was disabled years ago in an accident, and he also had several moving violations, and so really was not a fit driver at all. And so they got into a car accident, I think it was Bob Simon, and Bob Simon sadly wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and he was killed on the West Side Highway. So actually right down near where the Google offices are, and the Standard Hotel, that area. So it's just really, shocking, and make sure you know who you're getting into the car with or any vehicle, and make sure they have the proper, safety regulations that they've gone through, and they have all the permits. Okay, so that's today's morning movie news. I told you it would be a good one. I hope you agreed. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you everybody who entered. Congratulations to Alan and Augustine on your Everest Blu-rays. And please write down below what you think of today's top 3 stories and anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching.